So thank you again for the opportunity to come and share with you this morning. I recognize many faces that have been here when we've been here before, but I asked Kelsey whether he wants to introduce me or I introduce myself. But let me just tell you what the background for that question always. When I don't speak that much, but whenever I do, I always ask that question. And there's a real reason for doing that. As a speaker, the most important people in the room when you speak are you, the audience, right? And I like to know who the audience is that I'm speaking to. And I think any speaker would say that. If my message and what I share with you this morning is not pertinent to you, why did I come? Not why did you come? You came for a reason. You came to hear something that would be pertinent to you, right? And so it's important for any speaker to think ahead and to ask when you're asked to go and speak anywhere, and some of you are asked to do that, and I'm sure you do this. Ask who it is that I will be speaking to, and try to understand what the nature of that group might be. There's obviously the content then that you want to share. But here is a third thing that is actually the most important thing about speaking to any audience. The audience is important, and content that will resonate with that audience is important. But the most important thing is who will be the hero at the end of the talk? Me? No. That would be a very, very bad morning. If you walk out of here and say, wasn't Jim ever eloquent? Wasn't that amazing? I hope that doesn't happen. I'm going to try to say things in a vocabulary that is good and understandable and all the rest of that. But at the end of the talk today, or any talk that you listen to in a church or anywhere, at the end you have to ask yourself, who was the hero coming out of that story? And I'll tell you, there will be a hero at the end of of our talk today, right? And you will all catch who the hero is. So let me begin. And since I didn't introduce myself and who I am, for those of you that are here for the first time, let me do that quickly. I'm a ranch kid from southwest Saskatchewan. I married the young lady here after we left Bible school. And that's only 50 some odd years ago. We then did something for 1 year that's very special in our lives, and you young people that are here from Miller or elsewhere, you're young people, and not even only you young people, but any of you, it's never too late to become a pastor. Right? It isn't. It's never too late to become a pastor or a missionary or someone like that, right? So when we graduated from school, the first thing that we did was we spent 1 year in a little church in this denomination in a little town called Esk, Saskatchewan, which is in the Humboldt-Lanigan area. And it was a wonderful year. And from there it was university. And after that it was Swift Current and teaching high school for 30 years, raising 2 kids, coaching some football and hockey and baseball, and being in a church and all of those things which you do in life. And here we are today, right? Many, many years later. I have to admit that over the years, I spent a fair bit of time in this book, and I love this book. But quite frankly, it's in the last few years that really I've got into it much more seriously and have really considered, especially the gospel record, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and the story of Jesus. I don't think you can read that too often. A good friend of mine, who actually was an NHL hockey player, once told one of the guys on his team who was really struggling with life and afraid for what was going to happen in his life. He said, you know what? You don't have to be afraid of life. I'm going to give you a little book, and it happened to be a Gideon New Testament, and I'm going to tell you something very, very simply to do. If you're challenged by life, start on such and such a page, and the young man had no idea. He just gave, and that's why my friend gave him a page number, because he knew nothing of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. He had never been to church in his life, except probably for a funeral or a wedding. And he said, start reading on page 1, which would have been the first chapter of Matthew, and read all the way to such and such a page, which would have been the last words of John at the end of that gospel. And he said, if you don't understand anything that you've read, read it over and over and over again until you will understand, and I guarantee you, you will understand. It was several years later that that young man playing a hockey game against Wayne Gretzky in Edmonton said, I was not afraid of Wayne Gretzky. That wasn't the reason I made this decision, but I got down in my hotel room and committed my life to the Lord. having done nothing, having never been to church, having done nothing but read this book from page whatever to page whatever and read the story of Jesus over and over again. And so I recommend that to you. That's pretty good advice to anybody that we meet who is struggling with life, struggling with the challenges of life, and so on. The answer to all of those challenges is here, right, in those pages in the story of Jesus. So let's get on with today's talk. If you looked at Matthew chapter 13, I'm actually going to, don't turn to Matthew, but if you want, you can turn to Luke chapter 15, and this is a very familiar story. I know you will all know it. But I'm going to start by talking about Matthew chapter 13, because in chapter 13 of Matthew, Jesus kind of makes a change in his ministry to some degree. He had been doing a lot of miracles, and you'll see that early on in all the Gospels. He had been doing a lot of miracles. He'd been teaching people through his actions. Now in Matthew 13, his own disciples, having watched all of this, they kind of confront him and say, so why do you now switch? We sense you've made a little switch in the way you're looking at viewing people. You're not just healing them anymore and doing these kinds of things. You're doing that, but you're also teaching them a lot more, and you're doing it in an interesting way, almost a strange way. You're doing it in what we call parables. And some of these people are looking at you and they're shaking their head and they don't understand. Why are you doing that? And if you read chapter 13, you'll see he answers that question and explains why he taught in parables. Probably you could summarize all of Jesus' parables in John 3:16. For God so loved the world. That is the story of all of Jesus' parables, really, in a nutshell. 20-some years ago, on a Sunday night, Marilyn and I got a phone call. It was from our son. He was in Campbell River, British Columbia. He went there to take a summer job, and he was very, very excited on a Sunday night. And so we get on two phones. We could hear his excitement when he started the conversation. So what was he going to tell us? Well, he had done something very dramatic. For the week, a couple days earlier, he had made it possible for the young lady that he was seeing, who we had not even met, I don't think, at the time. Oh, we had met her once, yes. He had decided that he was going to ask her to marry him, is what it amounted to, but he had gone to quite a bit of fanfare to do this. He had hired a helicopter, and they were going to be flown to the west side of Vancouver Island. And he had hired some people that put together a nice lunch for them on a beach. And this is where this was all going to happen. I'll shorten the story because it's a very interesting story. But anyway, he had gone to a fair bit of, I didn't know my son was that much of a romantic, because his father certainly isn't. But anyway, he had, and at some considerable expense. And so there, with the waves of the Pacific lapping up on the shores of Vancouver Island, he proposed to her, and Brenda said yes, and it was all very exciting. So he told us in great, great detail what had happened. Well, the next morning, the really point of my story, I mean, it's great what happened there. The next morning, I have my grade 12 class, my grade 12 history class at the comp, and they're a wonderful group of kids. And so I decide I'm going to start this off. We can use a little bit of time for a personal story like this, so I tell it probably in about 5 or 7 minutes. And in the audience, of course, there are a bunch of young ladies and a bunch of young men. And the young ladies, as I'm telling this story, you could just tell that the anticipation of where this was going to go was continuing to heighten. They were excited with the story. I don't think I embellished it. I just told it the way my son told it. And the guys were, whatever, like, history is boring, but can we get on with history and so on, right? And so, but the really neat part of that story, so my point for telling you this story is really right here. In that audience were two groups of people hearing the same information. And for one group, the more I said, the more curious they became as to how is this all going to end. But for the other group, the longer I took, the more cynical they became about my story. And the more they said whatever in their minds, right? But the really neat part of it was, at the end of the story, I think it's all done. No. What turned out to be the valedictorian in that class that year was in my grade 12 history class, a young lady sitting in the middle row right at the back. She put up her hand, and without any hesitation, she said, "Mr. Ginther, do you have any more sons?" I unfortunately had to say no. She would have been a wonderful daughter-in-law if she was thinking that at all. So anyway, I better get on with this. But I'm telling you this story because that's exactly the kind of situation that Jesus faced every day, that he told stories, or that he met people. He met that group that hung on every word, right? Had so much anticipation for what he was going to do, for what he was going to say. They were the curious group. And then there was that other group that were the cynics. And would you believe it? The cynics were known as the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the scribes and the religious leaders of the day. And I hesitate, I feel embarrassed to tell you that. You already know it. I didn't have to tell you that, right? Would it be that we could be something more curious and less cynical? Might that be the case? And so, with that story told, Jesus gets in, let's get into chapter 15 of Luke. And you know that this audience now, as Jesus starts to tell this story, he says in verse 1, "Then all the tax collectors and the sinners drew near to him. The curious drew near to him to hear him. And the Pharisees and the scribes complained, saying, 'This man receives sinners and eats with them.' He spoke this parable to them, saying." So the parable now has three parts. I'm going to very quickly go over part 1 and part 2 and focus on the first part of part 3. And so the first parable, you know, is about the sheep and the shepherd and the lost sheep, and the shepherd goes after that sheep and finds it and brings it back, and there's great rejoicing. The second parable is about a lost coin. A lady in her home has lost her a coin of some value, and she searches for it diligently, sweeping the whole house. And when she finds it, she calls her neighbors in, and there's great rejoicing. So like the sheep they're just sheep. They get lost naturally, right? Like the lady, this is just an accident. She didn't intend to lose this valuable coin, but it just kind of happened. It was an accident. But the third story that Jesus tells is about a young man. And you know, this is not natural. This is not coincidental or accidental. This young man gets lost deliberately. He intends to get lost, not like the sheep and not like the coin, right? And so, as Jesus starts into this story, he starts by saying, down a little bit farther in verse 14, he said, "A certain man had 2 sons." Now, in that culture, having 2 sons, ultimately the possessions would be split between them. 2/3 would go to the older son, and 1/3 of the assets of the father would go to the younger son. And so when the younger son, as Jesus says next, came to his father and said, "Father, give me the portion of goods that falls to me," I can kind of imagine the older son being older and being maybe more experienced and maybe wiser, maybe not, would be looking at this young man and saying, "Now, brother, why are you doing this? Do you not recognize that to ask Father for our portion, each of our portions of his possessions, is an affront to him, first of all? Because this, in that society, would not be done while the father is alive. This would happen at the time of his death. So it is premature ask, first of all, and the father would know that, and the older son would know that, but the younger son would probably know it too, but he discounts it and says, "I will look after myself first, and what happens after that is somebody else's problem," right? And so he asks for the inheritance. And the father, what Jesus said next was, so he divided it to them, his livelihood. It says a lot about the father. You can read into that whatever you want to read into it. But for whatever reasons, the father, knowing what tradition was, chose to ignore tradition in this case and chose to give the young man what he asked for. And not many days after, the younger son gathered all together, journeyed to a far country, and there wasted his possessions with prodigal living. This is where the name for this parable comes from, right? From that word, prodigal. I would suggest to you that when we refer to this as the parable of the prodigal son, we've got a little bit of a mistake here. The son is prodigal, but the real prodigal in this story is not the son. And you'll have to think about that. You'll have to look up if that doesn't make sense to you. Look up in the dictionary what prodigal means, and then think of the other characters in the story and decide if the son is a prodigal, but he is not the greatest prodigal in this story, who is the greatest prodigal in the story? Nonetheless, he goes and spends lavishly that which he possessed, and which he felt was rightly coming to him. But when he had spent it all, there arose a severe famine in that land when he began to be in want. Several years ago, Marilyn and I met a young couple. They had been born and raised in India. Their names were Darren and Sweta. Wonderful young couple. Darren is an absolute genius. He has mathematics degrees in probability, and I don't even know how many of those. I don't understand probability at all. But he's a brilliant, brilliant man. At the time that we had met him, they had lived in 3 or 4 major cities in the world, and he had run some very, very major companies, especially freighting companies, shipping companies, distributing goods all over the world. And they had come to Canada, and they had purchased a home in Canmore, Alberta, in the mountains, and he was running a company here in Canada. When we met him and we got to know them a little bit, they started to tell us their story. And he told how that they had lived in these various cities, and then he got an opportunity while they were living in London, England, both of them living there, and they both were heading up major companies. He got an opportunity to go and run a company in Rio de Janeiro. And his comment about that was, as soon as I got that opportunity, I knew one thing. The salary that I was going to pay would give me a lifestyle that I could virtually do anything I wanted to do. I could live in the kind of accommodations I wanted, whatever kind. I could drive the cars I wanted. I could do on the nightlife scene whatever I could do. The money they were going to pay me for running this company, I could live whatever kind of lifestyle I wanted. And he said, secondly, I had read enough about Rio de Janeiro to know that if you can do it on this planet, you can do it in Rio. And those were exactly his words. If you can do it in this planet, you can do it in Rio. So he said, I was excited about going to Rio and getting involved in this company. So he said to Sweta, are you coming with me? She said, I've got a great job. I think just go and do your thing. He said, you know what? I wasn't surprised. The probability of her saying that was not a surprise to me at all. Why? Because I had a wonderful opportunity. She had a wonderful opportunity. But no, much, much more than that. Our relationship had deteriorated to where we were business only, and there was really nothing within our relationship any longer as husband and wife. So she just allowed me to go and make my move, and she stayed in London to continue running her company. And so I thought of Darren as I was reading through this passage of Scripture. I thought, well, there is a young man who saw that here was the ultimate happiness that he could enjoy in business and in life, and he saw it in Rio. I don't know which foreign country this is that the young man in Jesus' story might have been going to, but he was going to a foreign country too. And I think the foreign country, from Jesus' perspective, was just, where do you think is the ultimate experience to be found in life, right? That's what the word foreign country really means. And so this young man went there, and he sought for that. But, as Jesus said, when he had spent all of his resources, there arose a great famine in that land, and he began to be in want. Couldn't have maybe anticipated that when he first thought of the excitement of going to the most wonderful place in the world, right? And so, what could he do? He was destitute. He went and joined himself to a citizen of that country, and he sent him into the fields to feed swine, and you don't have to go into that. You know the implication of that for a Jewish boy. And he would gladly have filled his stomach with the pods that the swine ate, but no one gave him anything. I could be pretty despondent about this young man, foolish, frivolous, thinking that he would find the real meaning to life and the fulfillment that he was looking for in a foreign location. But there's something still deep within this young man that I'm attracted to, and it's in the next line. But when he came to himself, he said, when he stopped looking out the window, I guess you could sort of view it this way. When he stopped looking outside the window and started looking at himself and where life was really at for him, he began to think a little bit more seriously. He had lost his friends, he had lost his assets, he had lost his future, really. And he says to himself, how many of my father's hired servants have bread enough and to spare, and I perish with hunger? I will arise and go to my father and will say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you, and I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants. The first plan had failed, right? The first plan had failed miserably. The hope that he would really find himself in that foreign land with these assets had fallen apart totally, right? But not all is lost because he remembered. And I sometimes think, what a wonderful thing it is to have memory of what our past has been. And we remember those things that gave us a sense of worth, that gave us a sense of belonging, a sense of identity and of meaning and so on. And where did those come from for him? They came from what he remembered about his father's household. And so he decided that he would return to his father. And he would return with not a proud, arrogant, I'll do it myself, I'll do it my way spirit. No, he came back with a very, very humble spirit, willing to admit his error, willing to ask his father to forgive him and to restore him even as one of his servants. Not even thinking about being restored to the privilege that he had before as a son who had the right to assets. No, just restore me to a place of servanthood and I will be happy to be anywhere in your presence. And so this is what he decided. Let me continue the story of Darren. Darren came to a point in his life, this is very dramatic. He said, I was in Rio for a period of time, for a few years, but it began to happen to me that when I came back to my condo, which was on, I've forgotten what floor it was, 40th or 50th floor of some skyscraper or some major building in Rio, he said more and more I came back frustrated, unsure of where I was really at, unsure even of who I was. And he said, many days I would come, and with my key I would unlock the door to my condo. And the first thing I would do, I would walk through the kitchen, I would walk across the living room, I would open the door to the balcony, and I would look out over this massive city. And he said, it got to a point where I began to say to myself, is this the day? Is this the day? And that's what this young man kind of said. Is this the day? I have come to the end of my resources, my assets, everything that I thought was going to give me pleasure, was going to give me fulfillment, and so on. And it has all turned out to be a vapor. It has all turned out to be something totally besides what I thought it was going to be, right? And so there was Darren. And I'll finish that story in a little bit, just as we finish this story. And so he came to his father and said, but while he was still far off, came back to his father, and while he was still far off, the father saw him and had compassion and ran and fell on his neck and kissed him. Now that is a fairly unusual scene in a Jewish society, right? Let me say, first of all, I can't imagine the anticipation day after day of this father, though. He can't help but have known when his son is gone for a week, for 2 weeks, for a month, for a year, for 2 years, for whatever length of time it was. Jesus' story doesn't tell us. But he can't help but have anticipated the day when he sees that boy again. But along with that, there had to be the thought, but will I ever see him again? Will he ever return? There was no guarantee that that would ever happen, right? But I imagine that, as I said, I grew up in a ranch. I remember one thing about my father. You might identify with this, those of you that are older. One of the things my father did every day was the first thing that he got up, he walked to the window and he looked out at what the weather was. I imagine that this father, the first thing he did every day, every morning, was look out, not at the weather, but is this boy on the way back home? Might I see him someplace on the horizon, right? And then that day came, and the father did stuff that Jewish fathers shouldn't do. He ran in his long gown all the way for whatever distance to meet this young man before he ever got to the house, right? That was very, very undignified. If it was undignified for the young man to ask for his inheritance in Jewish society at this time, it is likewise undignified for this older gentleman to do what he did in those long flowing robes, to run in view of all of his neighbors down a road. They don't know why he's running, but something has happened here. What has happened to this man that he would do something in our society, in our community, so undignified, right? But it doesn't really matter to the father. Excuse me? And so he runs when he saw him at a great distance and falls on his neck. I imagine that when he fell on his neck, what that means is he hugged him. Big time hug, right? This wasn't kind of standing back and saying, you've been a really, really bad kid. Has anybody told you that before? Well, if nobody's told you that before, I'm telling you now, you have wrecked our family. You have spent foolishly all of the assets of not only me, but your elder son. You have embarrassed us in front. Jesus tells nothing like that, right? He ran and he embraced him. That's a little bit of a hard one for me to handle, right, personally. Maybe it's a hard one for all of us to handle. When life goes sideways, maybe in our families, in our network or whatever, the hardest thing is to run towards that situation and throw our arms around those that are hurting and those that have maybe made foolish decisions, right? And say, just come on home. Don't even say anything else than that. Just come on home. And that's really what the father says. And so he fell on his neck and kissed him. And the son says, before dad can say anything, apparently, from Jesus' story, Father, I have sinned against heaven. I really liked what he said here. I have sinned against heaven, because the word for heaven here is oros, O-R-O-S in the Greek. And what it means is you've sinned against the sky. Heaven does, we kind of think of sinning against heaven. Well, we did something against that future place that we're going. No, this young man is saying, I have just finished sinning against the sky, against you, Dad, against Mom, against my brother, against our whole community, against everything that exists, I have sinned. Would you kind of, as I think about the definition of sin, my first thought is, you know what, somebody did something really crazy and illegal. And then I might think of, and they did something even crazier than illegal, they did something that's immoral. I don't think that's what Jesus is talking about here. Sinning against heaven is doing something that is against the oros, against the sky, against heaven, is against God, right? So sin is really operating my life in contrast, in a conflict, in pressure against God, right? And so this is what he says to the father. The father, though, still doesn't respond to him at all. I think that's significant in the story. But who does he talk to? He talks to the servants. And he says, bring the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his hand and sandals on his feet. Let me stop there. Bring the best robe. It might, in fact, have been his robe. I don't know if he ran out there in his best robe or if his best robe was still in the closet at home. But I'd like to think that he gave him the best robe that he has, his robe. And that means it gave him a new status. And he also gave him a ring. A ring is a symbol of authority, of responsibility, and so on. And then he gave him sandals. Servants didn't walk in sandals. Only sons walked in sandals. So it's a restoration back to the sonship of this young man, right? And then he trumps it all with the last thing, and then he gave him a fatted calf. We're going to slaughter the fatted calf, not just one of the lame goats out there. No, we're going to slaughter the fatted calf. And the fatted calf is a symbol of reconciliation. Right? It symbolizes the only time we do this in our community, when we slaughter the fatted calf, it is to totally bring about the reconciliation between two parties that have been estranged. And so it's one thing to give the robe and a second to give the ring and to provide the sandals, but to go to the extent of slaughtering the fatted calf, That is the greatest extent that this father can go to. And then he says, let us eat and be merry, for this my son was dead. It's like he has arisen again. He's been resurrected, and he is alive again. He was lost and is found. And they began to make merry. So my friend Darren, standing on that balcony that day, finally said to himself, you know what? I've got two choices here. I can do what I'm contemplating doing. I can end my life from the 54th floor or whatever it was and end all of this misery because I'm not feeling very good about life. There's no future. By this time, he was barely in his late 30s, his early 40s at oldest. He had experienced, as he said, what you can do in Rio, I had done. And he had done it by himself, right? He said, but there is one other option. I did grow up in India, after all. And in India, there is how many hundreds of gods? If there's any truth or reality in life, could it be that if I went back to India, I could find why it is I'm so miserable in Rio? And this is not fulfilling at all. Could it be that if I phoned Sweta, she would actually go back with me, put the probability on the other foot? What would be the probability that we've hardly talked to each other over a period of time. What's the probability that she would actually consent to go back to India with me? But he took a chance. He phoned her in London, and she said, as much as this doesn't make sense in so many ways, because we're so estranged from one another, I will. I'll take my chance on you again, and I'll go back to India with you. They went back to India, and in telling the story, Darren says, one of the strangest things, not that we made this decision, but one of the strangest things, after having been in other parts of the world for so many years, we go back to India, and you would think we'd be all excited about Indian culture and Indian food and so on, but we find ourselves about 3 days later in a major city in India, and we go to McDonald's for something to eat. And when we walk into McDonald's, the sea of faces are all round faces. They're all native Indian people, except for one. In the back corner, there is a white face. And so you can't help but notice that. If you went to a room and there were all white faces and in the corner is one Afro-American, you would notice that when you walk into a room, and they did. And the Caucasian face smiled at them, and so Darren, being the kind of person that he is, probability guy, said, what's the probability that one white-faced guy in this room will smile at me when I walk in? I got to go find out. So order my meal, and I'll go and we'll see, why did he smile? As they talked to this person, the man told him that he was from North America. What was he doing in India? Well, he said that he was a pastor, a missionary. He never even didn't even know what that word meant. And he inquired further, and he found out what pastors and missionaries do. They tell people about Jesus, to put it fairly pointedly. He said, I'd never really heard about Jesus, I don't think. But he said within several days, after talking to this man over and over again and having him open the scripture to me, I came to realize this is why I came back to India. Not necessarily to find one of the gods. This was like Paul experienced in Acts chapter 17, right? The unknown God of India suddenly became the known God for Darren, and he committed his life to the Lord. Several weeks later, after watching her husband and the change that took place in Darren, Sweta said, this is the truth I was looking for too. I was seeking it in business. I was seeking it in making money too, just like he was. But this is the truth that I too was looking for. And so as we come to the end of this story, the story that Jesus told, I'm struck by who really is the hero in this story. Because it ends with, they began to be merry. A young man who had set out to prove that you find fulfillment in life, that you find happiness in life by spending everything that you have for your own gratification, came home very, very distraught, very unsettled, and so on. But he found his father was still there, willing to forgive him, even though he never asked for that forgiveness, willing to re-engage him and bring him back into the family. So I'd suggest to you that, number one, the hero in this story is really the father. it's not the Son. And the hero in all of our stories is also the Father. And when I first heard that statement, I thought of the number of times that I've had to share, and you can probably identify with this, for whatever reasons, the numbers of times that I've had opportunity to share my own story of how did I make the decision to follow Jesus and so on. But I had to think back and say, and what did people come away from me telling that story? Did they really see who the hero was? Or did they say, Jim, that's great that you recognize that you were a sinner, that Jesus had died for your sin, and all of that? I'm not trying to minimize that. But at the end of my story, did they recognize that the story was really about Jesus, and that Jesus came to connect lost sinners like me back to the Father? The unfortunate part of this story is what we haven't read today, that there is an elder brother in this story too. And that's maybe for another time. I'm not hoping that Pastor Blair gets sick and that I get a chance to come back and speak to you another time. But read that story and think about it from the perspective of, and who is the hero in the elder brother's story? If the younger brother thought he would be the hero in this story, he was mistaken, because it was the father who was the hero. And what about the elder brother? Entirely different story, eh? But I trust that that encourages you and inspires you. Let me end with this. You have a story too. Jesus never referred, I've been studying a series that I have to give at another place, and I'm looking at two things that we so commonly know about Jesus. Jesus was the Son of God, and Jesus was the Son of Man. Do you know that Jesus never referred to himself as the Son of God? But more than 80 times it's recorded in the Gospels that he referred to himself, or others referred to him as the Son of Man. Think of the humility of that. This is God's Son, never talking about the fact that he is the Father's Son. Oh, indirectly and so on, yes, he gave tremendous credit to his Father over and over and over again for his insights, for the power that he had, the authority he had, and so on, right? But he never drew attention to himself. He always drew attention to his Father. But what he did alongside that, the parallel to that was, I am the Son of Man. That didn't mean he was Joseph's son. That just means I am every bit human. I am as lost as any human being. But it's because he was that unique combination of Son of God and Son of Man that he could be our Savior. And so I leave with you today that one simple idea. When you tell your story, and please do that, in various ways you can tell your story, and you do that. But when you do, tell it in such a way that at the end of someone having heard your story, there will be no doubt as to the hero is. Father, thank you for this beautiful story and for its application to our lives, then in Jesus' name, amen.